Let's find out how a no-heel sock is really going to fit. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. A few months ago I asked about your favorite unique sock patterns, and a few months before that I had asked about your favorite free sock knitting patterns. And both of those times different people mentioned a no-heel sock, and they even linked to one. I'd never heard of this before. I always assumed that when you knit a sock you had to knit either a heel flap and gusset or a short row heel, but come to find out you can actually knit socks with no heels. There's no heel in this tube sock. It's really possible, and I knit a pair and we're going to find out if they actually fit. Now before we talk about how a no heel sock is actually going to fit, let's talk about its origins. Now one of the patterns that I looked at, and I found quite a few, you'll find some of them linked down below, mentioned the Mary Thomas's knitting book, which is I think published in the 30s. This is a reprint by Dover Publications, really inexpensive. You can find it on Amazon. I'll link to this as well. So she mentions the no-heel spiral sock in this book, and you can see there's a picture of it, that spiraling rib, and then she explains on the next page in just a few paragraphs exactly how this is worked. You don't need a long big pattern for this kind of a sock. You just need a few simple guidelines, and that's what I used. I used her book. I looked at some of the other free patterns I found online to figure out the basic premise of this sock. Then I started casting on and knitting a pair for myself. So the basic premise for a spiral sock or this no-heel sock is that you take a basic rib pattern. It can be knit 2, purl 2, like I did. Could be a knit 3, purl 3, pretty much any rib pattern. I've even seen a lacy one, which has me thinking about exploring that with some more patterns. But you take that pattern, you start with your cuff, you can knit that. I think I did about 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches up here. And then to get it to spiral, you're going to do the same exact pattern, but you're going to offset it by 1 stitch. So, for example, I started with a knit 2, purl 2. When I was ready to spiral, I did a purl 1, and then knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, all the way to the end, finished with a purl 1, so the pattern's still maintained, but it's shifted over by 1 stitch. Then once I established that, I did that for 6 more rounds. You can vary that as well. You could do 4 rounds, 5 rounds, 6 rounds. Then after I had done 6 rounds, I shifted it again. This time it was a purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, all the way to the end where I finished with a knit 2. And that maintained the pattern but shifted it by 1 stitch. And then I worked another 5 rounds. I had 6 rounds total for that. And then you can probably guess from here, I moved on to shifting the stitch 1 more time to, if that was a purl 2, then it's a knit 1, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, all the way to the end, finishing with a knit 1. 6 rounds of that, and then back to our knit 2, purl 2 for 6 rounds. And then those are your basic rounds. For me, it worked out to 24 rounds because I did 6 rounds of each, but you can choose a different rib pattern. You can decide how many rounds you want to work. Once you've established the first one, you just want to repeat that for each time you offset. If you do 5 rounds, then you want to repeat the 5 rounds again every time you offset the pattern. And that makes that basic rib pattern, it was just knit 2, purl 2, it makes a spiral around on the sock. So you don't need a heel because the premise is that spiral is going to hug your foot just like a rib pattern does. A rib sock always fits really nicely. But the premise is that you can skip the heel, and all of that twisted ribbing that's twisting around will hug the heel in place of the heel that you would actually knit in. This was a little concerning for me because I have a wide foot, a wide heel, and a high instep. So I was concerned that it wouldn't be enough to actually fit around my foot, or if I cast on too many stitches, it would be too big everywhere else to fit around my heel. But you'll discover what I discovered in a little bit. So once I had decided on the rib I was going to use, which is knit 2, purl 2, and the number of rounds I was going to do, the last thing to think about was the actual toe shaping. Now, there's a lot of different toes in knitting. If you've ever knit socks, you know there's lots of different toes. You can knit anatomical socks, asymmetrical toes. You can knit the standard wedge toe, which is very popular, round toes, spiral toes. And I was thinking about that, and I was going to just use the standard wedge toe. But what that does is create an automatic, like that sock has a right side and a top or an instep and the bottom, the sole of the foot. It automatically divides it into 2, and you always have to wear it that way because of the toe shaping And the other nice thing about this spiral is that there is no instep side and heel side. It's all the same all the way around. So I thought I wanted a toe that would also be all the same all the way around, so you could put this sock on any which way and it would always fit no matter what. So I ended up doing a round toe where I decreased every 8 stitches. I would knit 2 together, and then I would knit 6 rounds and then decrease again, knit 5 rounds, sort of like sometimes for the top of a hat you see that kind, and it just produces this very nice round toe. Sort of looks like the top of a hat right there, but there's no obvious top and bottom to the heel or to the toe. So that means I could wear this any which way. I could just grab it and put it on my foot and it would fit no matter how I put it on. So now that's the premise of the sock, and I want to walk you through my process for knitting this pair of socks. The first thing I did was I took my skein of yarn. In this case I used Cat Yarns. It's a yarn dyer here in Canada. This is her Tweed color on her BFL base, so a nice blue face Leicester, good for sturdy socks. I took that skein of yarn and I divided it. I caked it up and then divided it in half, so I had 2 equal balls, because my original thought was that I was going to keep knitting until I ran out of yarn, because not like, I mean, a regular sock, you knit the heel, you have to knit the foot to a certain length. You can't just keep knitting until you use up the yarn, because then your sock, who knows how long it's going to be. But with this type of a sock, since there's no heel, you can just keep on knitting until you've used up pretty much all the yarn and you leave enough for your toe. That was my original plan, but I have to say, after a while, knit 2 purl 2 rib gets boring. So I knit it for, I mean, I still had some left over. I could have gone probably for a couple more inches at least, but they were long enough for me and they fit my feet very well. But yes, you can. This is another one of those ways you can use up all of your yarn. If you want to like knit a pair of socks and use as much yarn as possible, this is a good way to do it. You just want to leave enough for your toe at the end. Once I had my pattern sorted out, the next step was to figure out how many stitches to cast on. And this was probably one of the scariest parts, because I was concerned that because there's no heel, when you knit a heel flap and gusset, you end up with a lot of stitches, which gives you a lot of space around your heel in that high arch, or instep if you have that. But with this type of a sock, you're not increasing anywhere. It's going to be the same size all the way down. So I wasn't sure if the usual stitch count I use, for me I usually knit 72 stitch socks on 1.25, 2.25 millimeter or US 1 needles. That's what I usually use, and my socks generally fit well. Depending on the stitch pattern, I might have to go down or up a needle size. But with this type of a sock, would it fit the same, or should I have gone up like another 4 stitches or 8 stitches more? I wasn't sure, but I figured I was just going to start with that 72 stitches and hopefully it would fit. And also my other original plan was to knit them both at once using 2 at a time on magic loop. But then I was thinking, if I cast on and I've knit some and then I want to stop and try it on and it doesn't fit, then I'll have been knitting 2 socks and I'll have to rip both of them out. And I didn't want to do that. So I figured, okay, back to the drawing board. We're going to do 1 sock at a time, double pointed needles. I'll just do that. And even with double pointed needles, you can try your sock on as you go and you'll see that I do that. So I knew that I could do that. I could start the sock, get enough knit, and then try it on to make sure it was going to fit over my heel, because that was the most concerning part. I did not want to knit a whole pair only to discover they weren't actually going to fit my wide foot. So once I had decided my rib pattern and had my yarn, I had decided on the toe shaping, and I decided I was going to cast on 72 stitches. It was time to get started. So I started with that basic knit 2 purl 2 cuff at the top with my 72 stitches. That stitch count works out just fine, and I worked that for 1.5 inches for the cuff of the sock. And then it was time to start that spiral pattern. That's where that magic happens. So like I explained before, I started the round with a purl 1 before working the knit 2 purl 2 pattern, and that shifted everything over by 1 stitch. Repeated that for 5 more rounds. Then I shifted the stitch pattern again by 1 stitch by working a purl 2 before I started that knit 2 purl 2 pattern. Did that for 5 more rounds, and then I offset it again by working a knit 1 purl 2 and then knit 2 purl 2 all the way around. And then you get back to your knit 2 purl 2 for your next 6 rounds. and that creates that shifting spiral of rib on your sock. So you just repeat those 4 rounds. It was actually 24 rounds total, 6 rounds of each of the 4 patterns. Then I just kept repeating them and repeating them until the sock was as long as I wanted it to be. The goal was to use up most of my yarn, but I didn't quite make it that far. I got really bored of knitting that knit 2, purl 2 rib. And it's really simple. I mean, it's just knit 2, purl 2. You just have to pay attention when you're offsetting the pattern. Count to make sure you're doing your 6 rounds, which most of the time worked out just fine. My only real issue was when we had an afternoon where we were watching some of the Mission Impossible movies, and one of them was really exciting. I think it was Ghost Protocol, and I forgot to offset my pattern, and I don't know how many rounds. I think I had to take out 4 rounds because I kept knitting without really paying attention to offsetting that pattern. But that was my mistake. So maybe no exciting movies while you're knitting your socks. And of course, after I'd knit enough of my sock, I had to stop and try it on to make sure it was going to fit. I didn't want to finish a whole sock only to discover it was going to be too tight and too small. So it was still on the double pointed needles, and I just sat down and I tried it on and pulled it up over my heel to make sure, and it actually fit over my heel. Believe me, I was really impressed that 72 stitches worked over my really wide heel and wide foot. So thankfully I could just keep knitting. I didn't have to rip it out and start over with more stitches. So if you're going to knit these socks, then, and you've knit socks before, then you can probably start with the usual stitch count that you use for your socks, and it should be just fine. So after I tried it on to make sure it was going to fit and I was comfortable with the 72 stitches, I just kept knitting until it was long enough, and really, I just got bored and decided to stop. It was long enough to get on my foot, so I figured I could start the toe instead of trying to use up every bit of yarn. So for the toe, you need a multiple of 8 stitches, which my stitch count was exactly that. I'll put the pattern, sort of the toe shaping, I'll put the instructions down below in the video description box in case you want to do this sock and you can use the same toe shaping. But if your stitch count isn't a multiple of 8, you want to work like a decrease round. Just knit around and then decrease 1 or 2 or 3 or however many stitches you have to decrease to get to a multiple of 8. And then you can start this toe shaping, which is really simple. You stop working your rib pattern and then you knit 8 stitches and then place a marker and repeat that all the way around. So you have groupings of 8 stitches. And I think in my case I have nine groupings of 8. And then you work a decrease round. You knit to 2 stitches before that first marker, and then you knit 2 together and slip your marker. And you repeat that all the way around. So I had 9 decreases in my sock. Depending on the size, you'd have more or less. But you just knit to 2 stitches before the marker, knit 2 together, slip the marker, repeat all the way around. And then because you are working 6 stitches before your decrease, that's how many rounds you work. So I just worked 6 rounds plain, just knitting around. Then I repeated the decrease round. So it was knit 5 and then knit 2 together, knit 5, knit 2 together, or basically knit 2 stitches before the marker and knit 2 together. But there are 5 stitches before that knitting 2 together decrease. So that's how many rounds you would work after. After your decrease round, you work 5 rounds, and then you work another decrease round. So you're knitting to 2 stitches before the marker and knitting 2 together. And in this instance, it's 4 stitches. You're knitting 4, knitting 2 together, slipping your marker and repeating that. So of course, you're going to knit 4 plain rounds and then repeat the decrease round and then knit 3 plain rounds. It's all spelled out down below. Very simple to work. And then right at the end, you just knit 2 together all the way around. You have just a few stitches. So like the top of a hat, you break the yarn, use a tapestry needle to weave in through those open loops, and then close it right up and weave in your ends, and that is it. And then give your sock probably a good soak and try them on to make sure they fit. Then of course I had to cast on and knit the second sock because I didn't want to have second sock syndrome here. And I made things even more difficult for myself by deciding the second sock should spiral in the opposite direction. So this sock goes this way. I wanted that sock to go that way. So of course you have to offset your pattern going in the other direction, which in my brain at the time, I'm like, oh, that's very simple. But when I sat down to start knitting, I wanted to immediately go into the pattern I'd already done, which was purl 1 and then purl 2. Like every 6 rounds you would offset by that pattern, but I'm even confusing myself now trying to explain it again. But because I wanted it to go the other way, I had to actually start with a knit 1 and then purl 2, knit 2 all the way around. And then Just very confusing, even still. So I wrote it on a Post-it just for the rounds I had to offset. I just had to know which stitch it was going to be, a knit 1 or a knit 2 or purl 1 or a purl 2, and I could not remember, so I just wrote down the order on a Post-it, kept that with me, and that jogged my memory to make sure I was doing the pattern in the correct way. So, of course, why make it easy on myself? No, let's make it hard. But I do like how they came out. They spiral into different directions. It came out really nice. And I was really impressed with these socks. And I'm very glad I didn't attempt to do that on 2 at a time on Magic Loop, because having to remember 2 stitch patterns going in 2 different directions, I think that really would have broken my brain. So here's a little video of the finished socks. You can see me trying them on. And of course, if I knit a longer leg, I could pull the sock up, but I grew up in the 80s and I like to scrunch my socks down. And my daughter also tried them on and she really liked the way they fit, even though at first she was a bit confused. She's used to normal hand knit socks where it's got an obvious top and a bottom with the heel. So that threw her for a second that there wasn't a certain way to put the sock on. But I'm really pleased with how they came out, and I'm looking forward to using the same idea and perhaps doing some sort of a lacy decorative rib and trying something like that. I think that could be really fun. It's really simple to knit these socks and just keep going. Just a great way to use up your yarn to try different things without having to worry about heel patterning or anything like that, or placement for your stitch patterns. Just a spirally rib sock. This was really such a fun project. I didn't realize that socks could be this simple to knit. It's a great beginner sock project as well, but I was really inspired, and I'm so thankful that you recommended these socks twice, at least twice, and it really made me stop and take a look and do some research into these patterns, and I hope that you give this a try as well. I'll put all my instructions and links and everything down below the video description box, so you can give this a try. And while you're knitting, why not hang out with me some more? And I'll put a playlist here of some of our knit and chat episodes where we sit and knit and chat about different sock knitting topics. So different ways to take care of your socks or sock fit, and lots of different sock knitting topics. So click right there and I'll see you in the next video.